November 1944. The Hurtgen forest was a graveyard of trees and men. Rain fell in sheets through the black pines, turning the ground into a sucking pit of mud and frozen leaves. American infantry crouched low behind shattered trunks, their faces pale and streaked with dirt. Somewhere ahead, German voices echoed through the fog, followed by the dull thud of mortar fire. Then came a sound that sliced through the forest, the deep rhythmic hammer of a Browning automatic rifle. Short, vicious bursts cut the air. Each pull of the trigger sent 20 rounds downrange in seconds. The forest answered with screams, splintered wood, and sudden silence. German soldiers pinned in the open, dropped where they stood, their formations torn apart before they even saw the enemy. For the men behind the BAR, it was survival. Cold, automatic, necessary. For those on the receiving end, it was chaos and disbelief. In the months that followed, entire German companies would whisper of the devil's machine gun, and commanders would note desperate requests for transfer. But to understand how this weapon earned such fear, we must go back to its birth, its doctrine, and the soldiers who carried its burden. The story of the Browning automatic rifle began long before the dark forests of Europe. Its roots stretched back to the final years of the First World War, when armies still measured firepower by the weight of their machine guns. In 1917, the United States entered the conflict with outdated rifles and borrowed tactics. John Moses Browning, a quiet mechanical genius from Utah, had been perfecting something different. A shoulder-fired weapon capable of automatic fire, light enough to move with the infantry. His creation, the M1918 bar, weighed around 16 pounds and fired the 30-06 round at 500 rounds per minute. It could be carried into battle by one man, yet deliver a stream of bullets that once Rakili, Eward a crew and tripod. When it arrived in France in 1918, American troops carried it forward through fog and shellfire, advancing not behind the machine gun, but beside it. That idea, walking fire, was revolutionary. The war ended before the weapon could reshape tactics, but its potential was obvious. Between the wars, the BR lingered in arsenals and training fields. It was heavy, loud, and prone to overheating, but it was reliable, and American commanders trusted reliability above all. The 1920s and 1930s saw few military experiments. Isolationism ruled, budgets shrank, and the army of the future became the army of memory. Yet small groups of officers studied the lessons of Europe and concluded that any future war would depend on mobility, firepower that could move, men who could close quickly under covering fire. When global conflict returned in 1939, the United States possessed an outdated army but a dependable core of weapons. The BAR was among them, redesigned and modernized as the M1918A2 with a bipod, new buffer, and two-rate selector for either slow or rapid fire. As the army expanded from a few 100,000 to millions, the BAR became the heartbeat of the rifle squad. American doctrine built its small units around it. A standard squad of 12 men centered on one automatic rifleman and an assistant who carried spare magazines. Their job was simple: deliver suppressive fire, pin the enemy, and allow the rest of the squad to maneuver. Every training manual emphasized this rhythm, base of fire and movement. The bar was not meant to dominate battles like the German MG-42. It was meant to give each squad its own small pocket of machine gun strength. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Germany built its infantry philosophy around a different center of gravity. German squads revolved around the light machine gun. The MG-34 and later the MG-42 were technological marvels, air-cooled, belt-fed, with blinding rates of fire exceeding 1,200 rounds per minute. The rifleman existed to feed and protect the gun. In theory, this gave the Wehrmacht unmatched firepower. In practice, it required steady logistics, large ammunition reserves, and unbroken communication. As the war dragged on, fuel shortages, air attacks, and shattered supply lines made these advantages harder to sustain. When American forces landed in North Africa in 1942, their BARs saw only limited combat. Desert fighting favored tanks and artillery. But in Italy, and later in Normandy, the weapon began to find its true environment: close terrain, hedgerows, forests, and ruined towns. There, the BAR's portability became priceless. A gunner could fire from the hip while advancing, shift positions in seconds, or hold a narrow street alone. Its 20-round magazine seemed small, but each burst was accurate and deadly. The .30-06 round punched through walls, helmets, and even thin steel plates. German troops, trained to expect suppression from heavy tripod guns, were shocked by the precision and persistence of a single man's automatic weapon. The U.S. infantryman carrying the BAR was more than a rifleman. He was a symbol of a doctrine that favored initiative over hierarchy. Each squad was expected to think, move, and act independently. This flexibility often confused German commanders who expected rigid formations. American fire teams advanced in bounds, one group firing while the other moved, the BAR anchoring the line. In reports from Italy and France, officers praised its effect. With the BAR in position, the squad is secure. Without it, they are blind. The contrast between the two systems, Germany's machine gun-centered squad and America's balanced fire team, would shape the brutal infantry battles of 1944. When these doctrines collided in the mud and forests of Western Europe, each side discovered both the strengths and weaknesses of its faith in firepower. The German MG-42 could dominate open ground, but its weight and ammunition needs limited mobility. The BAR could not sustain continuous fire, yet it moved with the men, turning every thicket and foxhole into a fortress. By the summer of 1944, this difference would decide the fate of countless platoons. And as the war pushed toward Germany itself, that difference became the Germans' nightmare. By mid-1944, the Western Front had turned into a labyrinth of hedgerows, villages, and shattered forests. After the Normandy landings, the U.S. Army discovered that the open fields of France quickly gave way to thick bocage, dense earth walls lined with tangled brush. Tanks struggled to move. Artillery fire was often muffled, and combat fell once again to small units of infantry. In that claustrophobic landscape, the Browning automatic rifle came into its own. It was not a weapon of spectacle. It was a weapon of endurance. The gunner crouched behind a mound of earth, firing short, controlled bursts to cut through the greenery. German soldiers advancing through the hedges suddenly found themselves under intense automatic fire at ranges they thought were safe. Many did not survive long enough to fire back. Reports from Normandy describe platoons reduced to half strength after running into well-placed bar positions. German survivors called it a storm that came from the ground. The bar's accuracy and the American soldiers' aggressiveness made a lethal combination. The Germans had relied for years on the terror of the MG-42. Now, they were facing small units that could return almost equal fire without the burden of heavy tripods or belts. U.S. troops moved with a rhythm of fire and motion, one team suppressing, the other flanking, often catching enemy positions before they could recover. By autumn, the battlefield shifted to Belgium, the Netherlands, and eventually into the dark German forests. The Hurtgen Forest became the proving ground for every doctrine both sides believed in. It was a world of mist, shattered trunks, and endless mud. The forest swallowed tanks and silenced artillery. Visibility rarely extended beyond 30 yards. In those conditions, the bar was not just useful, it was decisive. American squads advanced tree by tree, the gunners' steady bursts cutting lanes through the undergrowth. German defenders used to long-range engagements suddenly faced close-quarters fights where their belt-fed guns jammed or overheated. Many had to abandon their weapons when American fire crept too close. Field reports from both sides reveal a striking pattern. German commanders noted that American infantry units, though less experienced in theory, displayed remarkable fire coordination. In reality, that coordination was anchored by one weapon. A single bar could hold off an entire section if positioned well. The U.S. Army encouraged initiative at the squad level. Sergeants and corporals made split-second decisions, often relying on their barman to maintain pressure. German doctrine emphasized centralized control, and in the chaos of collapsing communications, unitsm. By the winter of 1944, the image of a lone American gunner crouched behind a smoking bar had become a symbol of inevitable pressure, slow, grinding, and unstoppable. For the German infantry, each burst meant not only the loss of comrades, but the collapse of confidence in their once dominant machine gun doctrine. The next phase of the war would test that doctrine to its breaking point, and it would reveal how one weapon, in the hands of determined men, could reshape the battlefield's balance. The Browning automatic rifle was not only a machine of metal and fire, it was a test of human endurance. Every bar gunner carried more than just a weapon. He carried the heartbeat of his squad. The weapon weighed over 20 pounds without ammunition, and its 20-round magazines added even more. Barmen were often chosen for their strength and steadiness under pressure, but even the strongest felt the strain after hours of crawling, firing, and reloading. The gun rested on the shoulder like a living thing, hot to the touch, its barrel glowing faintly after each exchange. Sweat and gun oil mixed into mud on their hands. The men who carried it developed an instinctive rhythm, short bursts, quick reloads, calm breathing between the chaos. To the rest of the squad, the bar gunner was the anchor. In the confusion of close combat, his weapon was the sound they trusted most. For many of these men, the responsibility was crushing. They were first to open fire and last to withdraw. Enemy snipers learned to target the bar's distinctive silhouette, and every burst gave away their position. Some gunners tied strips of cloth around the barrel to break the shine. Others smeared mud over the metal to blend into the landscape. Every decision carried a cost. A few extra seconds of firing could mean victory, but it could also invite an enemy mortar. Veterans later spoke of a strange pride that came. This autonomy contrasted sharply with German methods. The Wehrmacht valued coordination and rigid control. Its infantry squads, though highly trained, relied on the machine gun's dominance. The riflemen functioned as extensions of the gun crew, providing ammunition and covering fire. When that gun went down, the squad's structure often collapsed. The American approach was messier but more resilient. If one bar jammed or was lost, another squad nearby could fill the gap. Firepower was distributed rather than centralized. This meant that in prolonged engagements, the Americans could adapt faster. Even when communications broke down in the woods or streets, the rhythm of bar fire served as both direction and morale. To the Germans, this adaptability felt unnatural. Their reports described the Americans as fluid and elusive, their small units capable of appearing from unexpected directions with sudden, coordinated bursts. Much of that perception stemmed from the presence of the bar. Its bursts created the illusion of multiple machine guns, sowing confusion. A German platoon pinned by one bar often believed it faced an entire company. Fear magnified sound. The weapon's distinctive pattern echoed through forests and ruins, amplifying panic. Soldiers who survived such encounters described the sensation as being hunted by invisible enemies. The psychological angle became increasingly important as the war dragged on. By late 1944, the German soldier was no longer the confident aggressor of earlier years. He was often young, undertrained, and exhausted. Facing a steady drumbeat of bar fire under poor visibility, he began to lose faith not only in his weapon, but in the idea of victory itself. American after-action reports recorded intercepted German messages requesting to be reassigned from frontline duty. Some units claimed their men were not suited for continuous contact when method known as fire and movement was not just a tactic, it was the lifeblood of American infantry combat. Officers drilled it endlessly during training, and by the time their men reached France, it had become instinct. The bar's accuracy allowed short, precise bursts that suppressed rather than wasted ammunition. In the thick of a firefight, A good gunner could hold an entire enemy section in place, long enough for his comrades to close in. This synergy gave American units a flexibility the Germans rarely matched. When the two systems collided, German squads built around a single machine gun and American squads balanced around the bar. The results depended on initiative. German soldiers relied on preset fields of fire and overlapping coverage, which worked beautifully in defense, but faltered in fluid terrain. The Americans, less bound by rigid formations, adapted on the fly. The bar's portability meant a new firing position could be established within seconds, confusing German observers. Battles became unpredictable, shifting in tempo and direction. German officers complained in reports that enemy automatic rifles appear everywhere at once, an exaggeration born from exhaustion, but one that spoke to the weapon's tactical effect. The illusion of omnipresence was often enough to paralyze counterattacks. In close-range combat, particularly within villages or forests, the bar transformed from a support weapon into an assault tool. Gunners fired from the hip as they stormed through doors or trenches, the gun's heavy muzzle climbing with each burst, but delivering devastating effect. At ranges under 50 yards, its stopping power was absolute. German accounts from Hürtgen, Aachen, and the Siegfried Line described entire assault teams cut down before crossing a street or clearing a bunker approach. American doctrine never intended for the bar to replace grenades or subma. Leadership played a vital role in amplifying that effect. American platoon leaders learned quickly that survival depended on initiative at the lowest levels. A lieutenant or sergeant did not wait for orders from headquarters. He listened to the tempo of his squad's fire. If the BAR roared, it meant the enemy was suppressed and it was time to move. If it fell silent, it meant trouble. This auditory feedback loop gave small units cohesion, without the need for radio or shouted commands. German leaders, accustomed to centralized direction, struggled to maintain that level of reactive coordination once chaos set in. In the smoke and noise of combat, adaptability mattered more than doctrine, and the BR's steady rhythm gave Americans that edge. Morally and emotionally, the weapon carried weight far beyond its metal frame. It became a symbol of reliability, a reminder that no matter how desperate the situation, every squad had the means to fight back. The gun's presence calmed nerves, its noise encouraged courage. Soldiers spoke of the comfort they felt when they heard another BR open up nearby, even if unseen. It meant they were not alone. For the Germans, that same sound became a warning. Veterans later described the distinct dread of hearing the first staccato burst through the fog. It meant the Americans were close, perhaps already surrounding them. That anticipation drained resolve faster than bullets. As the war entered its final year, fatigue and desperation colored every engagement. The BR's dominance was not measured only in casualties, but in psychological erosion. Each encounter taught the Germans that every grove, every ruined farmhouse, could hide an automatic rifle waiting to unleash destruction. Some frontline reports to the German High Command noted that the enemy's small-caliber automatic weapon fire exceeds expected levels. The reality was simpler. The Americans had learned to use their tools to perfection. Their weapons were not the fastest or most advanced, but they were practical, dependable, and integrated into a system that emphasized human judgment over mechanical superiority. That philosophy mirrored the character of the American soldier himself, improvisational, persistent, and unyielding. The BR embodied those traits. It was neither elegant nor refined, yet it worked, just as its users did. By the time the fighting reached the German border, both sides knew that control of any position depended on who could establish suppressive fire first. More often than not, it was the bar that dictated that outcome. As the snow of December began to fall across the Ardennes, this lesson would be written again in blood. There, amid freezing forests and desperate counterattacks, the full impact of the BR's presence would become undeniable. For the German infantry, already shaken by months of attrition, the weapon's thunder would mark the breaking point of faith in their once unquestioned superiority. In December 1944, The Ardennes lay silent beneath a blanket of snow. Trees sagged under ice, and visibility was a ghostly haze. Then, before dawn on the 16th, the German army launched its last great offensive. Thousands of men poured through the mist, supported by armor and artillery, striking at thinly held American lines. It was the Battle of the Bulge, and for the U.S. infantry, it began as chaos. Units were scattered, communications severed, and supply lines crushed under surprise. Yet amid the confusion, small pockets of resistance formed. Platoons, squads, sometimes only a handful of men. In those moments, the BAR once again became the weapon of survival. At crossroads and frozen ridges, American infantrymen dug shallow foxholes and waited. Snow hissed on hot barrels. The bar gunners lay flat, eyes straining through the fog. When the first gray shapes emerged, they opened fire in short, biting bursts. Each magazine disappeared in seconds, the gun kicking against their shoulders like a heartbeat made of steel. German soldiers, advancing in tight groups, fell by the dozen. The muzzle flash cut through the white air, tracing a rhythm that echoed through the trees. In reports later filed by the 99th and 2nd Infantry Divisions, officers described entire companies of German infantry pinned or destroyed before they reached American lines. The Ardennes was not the open ground of the Eastern Front, nor the fortified ruins of Italy. It was intimate killing ground. Villages, forest trails, narrow roads hemmed in by snowbanks. The MG-42, once the terror of Europe, struggled in these conditions. Its belts froze, its barrels warped, and its crews became easy targets. The BAR, with its detachable magazine and closed bolt design, endured. Its simplicity was its strength. A gunner could clear a jam in seconds with bare hands, reload under fire, and resume shooting before the enemy adjusted. In squad after squad, the weapon became the pivot on which defense turned. The Germans expected to overwhelm with numbers. Instead, they found their formations shredded before closing to grenade range. One engagement near the village of Krinkelt illustrates the moment's brutality. A German assault company, numbering more than 100 men, advanced through waist-deep snow toward the edge of the town. Inside a line of shattered houses, fewer than 30 Americans waited, among them 2 BTE-AR gunners positioned at opposite ends of a street. As the Germans approached, the gunners opened up in alternating bursts, cutting through the first ranks and forcing the survivors to dive into the snow. Grenades exploded against walls, machine guns rattled in reply, but the Americans held. Over 3 hours of fighting, the Germans attacked repeatedly, leaving dozens of bodies frozen in place. When the battle ended, fewer than half of them returned to their lines. Survivors later told interrogators that they believed they had faced a much larger force, armed with heavy machine guns. In truth, it was 2 automatic rifles and a handful of carbines. Moments like these were repeated across the front. At Bastogne, Clairvaux, and St. Vith, small American units held crossroads long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Each stand shared the same heartbeat, the thump of a bar cutting through the blizzard. The sound became synonymous with resistance. Commanders began assigning extra ammunition to BR teams, knowing their presence could stabilize a collapsing sector. In after-action reviews, officers noted that morale often rose simply when a gunner rejoined his squad after resupply. The psychological link between survival and the BAR was unmistakable. For the Germans, the opposite held true. Their assault tactics, built around overwhelming bursts from machine guns, faltered against opponents who could deliver comparable fire without cumbersome setups. Reports from the 12th Volksgrenadier Division mention persistent American automatic fire that prevents forward movement even with artillery support. The precision and cadence of the BR's fire fooled attackers into believing they faced multiple heavy weapons. It was a weapon that turned terrain itself into an ally. Every foxhole, doorway, and snowbank became a firing position, every silence a trap. Behind these victories were men operating at the edge of endurance. BR gunners fought until the skin of their hands cracked from cold and oil. They learned to reload with numb fingers, to balance accuracy against exhaustion. Many could barely hear after days of continuous combat. Yet they stayed at their posts, because their squads depended on them. The responsibility was immense. If the BR fell silent, the squad's defense usually collapsed. One veteran later recalled, "The BR was the heartbeat of the platoon. If it stopped, everything stopped." That heartbeat, steady and defiant, carried through the winter. The Battle of the Bulge marked the breaking point of the German infantry's confidence. Once proud veterans of earlier campaigns now faced a relentless, decentralized enemy who refused to yield. Requests for transfer multiplied as casualty lists grew. Some German units reported losing entire companies in a single day to intense American automatic rifle fire. Others described morale collapsing even before combat began. The myth of the invincible Wehrmacht infantry dissolved under the weight of attrition and the realization that technology alone could not guarantee victory. By January 1945, the snow began to melt, revealing the bodies left behind. American squads moved through the quiet forests, weapons slung, faces hollow. The bars they carried were scratched, their barrels blackened, but they still worked. The men who had wielded them understood now what the weapon had done. Not just to the enemy, but to themselves. They had become extensions of its rhythm, bound by its recoil and sound. The Ardennes had proven that the balance of infantry power in Europe all had shifted for good. And as the Allies advanced into Germany, that shift would follow, bringing the same fear to every village and trench ahead. As the Ardennes campaign dragged into January 1945, German command realized their offensive had failed. What had begun as Hitler's desperate gamble to split the Allied front now turned into a grinding retreat under relentless pressure. The skies cleared, and with them came American air power. Bombers and thunderbolts strafed columns of retreating troops, smashing bridges and convoys. Yet on the ground, the most intimate destruction still came from the infantry, from the steady pulsing rhythm of the BAR. The weapon had turned from a support rifle into a tool of domination. Wherever American units counterattacked, its presence defined the momentum. In town after town, from L'Église to Foy, the fighting moved house to house. The Germans who had once advanced confidently through snow and fog now found themselves trapped in claustrophobic ambushes. Inside ruined buildings, BR gunners crouched behind broken walls, firing through doorways and shattered windows. The recoil jolted through their shoulders as plaster rained down, and each burst tore through the narrow streets. German squads attempting to maneuver were cut to ribbons. Civilians who had remained in their basements later described the sound as endless, short, rhythmic explosions echoing through the night like the heartbeat of the battle itself. The Americans had learned. They no longer charged blindly into machine gun nests. Instead, they coordinated firepower with patience. The BR became the centerpiece of this new discipline. It was light, enough to move between cover, but powerful enough to dominate open ground. 2 or 3 bar teams working together could suppress an entire German platoon. In field manuals revised during the winter, commanders explicitly encouraged overlapping BAR fields of fire. The goal was not to spray bullets, but to create controlled chaos. To make the enemy believe every step forward invited death. In one such engagement near the Belgian village of Foy, a German counterattack struck elements of the 101st Airborne. The Americans, low on ammunition and supplies, huddled in the ruins of a farmhouse. A single bar gunner, Private James O'Hara, set his weapon on the windowsill and waited. When the Germans advanced across the open snow, he opened fire in rhythmic bursts, cutting down the lead elements. When his barrel overheated, he switched it quickly, resumed firing, and refused to yield. Witnesses later said he fired nearly 20 magazines in under 10 minutes. The attack collapsed, leaving dozens of Germans scattered across the field. That kind of performance was no longer rare. It had become the expectation. Every company had its O'Hara, its steady gunner holding the line when everything else seemed lost. As the front stabilized, American counteroffensives began to push eastward. In the forests near St. Vith, units of the 7th Armored Division advanced cautiously through the snow, accompanied by infantry armed with BARs. The Germans fought desperately to delay the inevitable. Their officers ordered men forward in small assault teams, hoping to flank and silence the automatic rifles. But the terrain betrayed them. The thick undergrowth and snowdrift slowed every move, and before they could get close, the BRs spoke again. Bursts tore through the white fog, cutting down entire fire teams. One German corporal later recounted to Allied interrogators, "We were trained to fear the American machine gun, but in the Ardennes, it was the rifle we feared most. The rifle that fired like a machine gun, but never stopped." For many Germans, the psychological toll was greater than the physical. Their army had once advanced behind the terrifying chatter of MG-34s and MG-42s. Now they faced that same intensity turned against them, compact, mobile, and unpredictable. Every hedgerow, every pile of rubble could conceal a weapon capable of tearing through squads in seconds. Veterans who had survived the Eastern Front found the experience disorienting. The Americans, once dismissed as inexperienced and slow, now fought with surgical aggression. The BAR was not the only reason for this transformation, but it embodied it perfectly: precise, efficient, and unstoppable. By mid-January, the German line was collapsing. The offensive had cost them tens of thousands of men, and their reserves were gone. American divisions advanced through towns reduced to blackened skeletons of brick and timber. Among the ruins, the smell of gun oil and cordite lingered. The snow was streaked with rust-colored stains. In after-action reports, officers noted that German morale was fatally weakened. Prisoners spoke of units refusing orders, of commanders unable to rally men who no longer believed in the war. Many asked for transfers away from the front, citing exhaustion and hopelessness. Some simply deserted in the night, leaving their weapons buried in the snow. For American soldiers, there was no triumph, only grim persistence. They were tired, half-frozen, and numb to victory. Yet they recognized what had changed. In the early years of the war, German infantry had seemed invincible. Faster, better armed, more coordinated. Now, the balance had reversed. The Americans had mastered combined arms warfare, integrating air, armor, and infantry into a relentless system. And within that system, the BAR had earned its place as the infantry's soul. It was not glamorous, not as revered as the M1 Garand, or feared like the MG-42. But it was the weapon that never failed them when everything else did. As February dawned, the snow melted into mud. The Ardennes thawed into a graveyard of ambition. The German army, once the most disciplined force in Europe, was retreating toward the Rhine. The Allied advance pressed forward, and every step brought them closer to the heart of Germany. Behind the front, ordnance officers inspected recovered weapons from the battlefield. Among the twisted steel and shattered rifles, they found BRs still serviceable after weeks in freezing conditions. Many were cleaned, reloaded, and sent back to the line. They had become the soldier's constant companion, scarred, loyal, and unyielding. The climax of the Ardennes was not marked by a single explosion or surrender. It was the slow extinguishing of German will under the mechanical rhythm of American firepower. The BAR's steady bursts, multiplied across 1,000 hillsides, created a sound that echoed far beyond the snow. It was the sound of inevitability, of an army learning, adapting, and finally mastering the art of modern war. That mastery would carry them across the Rhine, through the ruins of Germany, and into the final battles of Europe. The turning point had come, and in the cold silence that followed, both sides understood that the tide of war had shifted forever. The weapon that once served as mere support had become the symbol of dominance. From the forests of Belgium to the streets of Cologne, the legacy of the BR was now written in smoke, snow, and the memory of those who had faced it. When the guns finally fell silent in the Ardennes, the world the German army once commanded was gone. The offensive that Hitler had promised would split the Allies and force a new peace had instead shattered the last illusion of German strength. Across the snow-covered hills of Belgium and Luxembourg lay the wreckage of an army that had run out of fuel, ammunition, and faith. Frozen tanks littered the roads, their crews still inside. Abandoned artillery stood mute in the forests. And beneath the trees, the bodies of infantrymen, many scarcely more than boys, were strewn beside the rifles they could no longer carry. For the Americans, victory was grim and costly. The Battle of the Bulge had been the largest and bloodiest fight the U.S. Army ever fought. Nearly 90,000 casualties in 6 weeks, dead, wounded, and missing. But the German losses were worse. Over 100,000 men lost, tens of thousands taken prisoner, and an entire offensive force erased from history. In its wake, the Allies found something more than victory. They found proof that their soldiers, once dismissed as inexperienced and soft, had become hardened professionals capable of standing against the best the Wehrmacht could muster. The weapon that symbolized that transformation was not a tank or a plane, but a rifle carried by the infantry. The Browning automatic rifle. In every after-action report, the same refrain appeared. Units credited the BAR for their survival during encirclements, delaying actions, and counterattacks. Company commanders praised its reliability in freezing weather, its precision in close combat, and its psychological effect on enemy troops. The Germans, for all their technical brilliance, had never produced a weapon quite like it. One that balanced mobility, control, and automatic fire so perfectly that it turned every squad into a miniature machine gun team. For American infantrymen, it was more than a tool. It was reassurance, a steel heartbeat that told them they could hold out just a little longer. In the weeks that followed, as U.S. forces advanced toward the Rhine, stories of individual BR gunners spread quietly through the ranks. Men spoke of soldiers who had stood their ground against overwhelming odds, who had covered retreats, who had fired until their barrels glowed red and their fingers blistered. These stories were not exaggerated for glory. They were whispered as lessons of survival. Every rifleman knew the sound of the BAR's rhythm in battle. 2 or 3 bursts, a pause, another 2. That rhythm had meant life. To hear it was to know that someone was still fighting beside you. German prisoners confirmed what Allied soldiers suspected. Many admitted that their morale collapsed when they encountered units with strong automatic rifle fire. They described the weapon's distinct cadence, slower than the MG-42's buzz, but relentless, accurate, and unnerving. You could not escape it, one captured sergeant said. The Americans did not stop shooting. The rifle followed you step by step. Interrogation summaries from January 1945 mention entire companies requesting transfers away from American sectors. Some reports even note units refusing to advance once word spread that Browning units were holding the line. It was a small but telling sign that the balance of fear in infantry warfare had shifted. The psychological victory was as crucial as the tactical one. For years, German infantry had relied on shock, fast, decisive attacks designed to break morale before breaking bodies. But at the Ardennes, they found themselves outmatched by an enemy who no longer broke. The American infantry had learned endurance, and their weapon reflected that endurance perfectly. The BR did not promise overwhelming firepower. It promised constancy. It was the sound of men refusing to yield. In the ruined villages and frozen forests of Belgium, that constancy left its mark. Civilians emerging from basements after weeks of hiding recalled the rhythm of automatic fire echoing across valleys, rising and falling through the night. To them, it was the sound of liberation. For the soldiers who survived, it became something quieter, a reminder of friends who had not returned. They cleaned their weapons in silence, checked the bolts, and carried them forward into Germany, knowing they would need them again. The Ardennes had been the last great test of the infantrymen's endurance in Europe. And in that crucible, the weapon that began as a 1918 relic had proven itself timeless. The bar was no longer an experiment or a relic of another war. It was the weapon that had saved entire divisions and crushed the last hope of a German victory in the West. The soldiers who carried it would soon march toward the Rhine, toward a new phase of war that promised not triumph, but revelation. Because what they found beyond those frozen hills would redefine what victory truly meant. As February turned into March 1945, the snow melted into black mud, revealing the full cost of the Ardennes. The German army, once so confident in its discipline and firepower, now limped eastward toward the Rhine. Broken units merged into one another, their command structures shattered. For many soldiers, there was no longer a front, only survival. They trudged through ruined villages and empty forests, clutching rifles that had lost their purpose. Behind them, the Americans advanced methodically, every step accompanied by the thud of supply trucks and the click of rifle bolts. The Allies did not celebrate. They buried their dead and repaired their weapons. The BRs that had fought through the snow were cleaned, re-oiled, and returned to their gunners. Armorers noted that even after weeks of exposure to ice and mud, most still fired perfectly. Its design, once considered outdated, had outlasted more complex weapons. The simplicity that made it old-fashioned also made it eternal. The soldiers who had doubted it when they first received it in training now trusted it more than anything else they carried. It never quit, one sergeant said. When everything froze, trucks, radios, even men, the bar still fired. In the chaos of retreat, German prisoners revealed a growing despair. Some claimed their units had been mowed down like wheat by American fire. Others spoke of entire platoons destroyed before they could close the distance. Officers, once proud of their tactical superiority, began requesting withdrawal or reassignment. One divisional report from the German 18th Volksgrenadier Division stated simply, "Infantry cannot advance under sustained American rifle fire. Morale collapsing." These were not excuses. They were confessions of defeat. The Wehrmacht's infantry, once the sharpest blade of the Reich, had been dulled beyond repair. When the Americans finally reached the Rhine, they carried with them not only momentum, but confidence. The lessons of the Ardennes were etched into their memory. Discipline, patience, and the importance of individual firepower. In an army built around mass production and logistics, the BAR had reminded them that wars were still won by men with weapons in their hands and courage in their hearts. The weapon had become a bond between soldier and squad, between survival and victory. The tactical impact reached beyond the battlefield. Allied strategists studying the Ardennes campaign concluded that the American infantry's resilience came largely from its decentralized firepower. Each squad had multiple automatic rifles, allowing it to operate independently when leadership broke down. This realization influenced post-war doctrine and the development of future small arms. The concept of the automatic rifle, a lightweight, shoulder-fired weapon bridging the gap between rifle and machine gun, would shape the design of weapons for generations. The BAR's mechanical rhythm echoed into the future, from Korea to Vietnam, long after its war had ended. For the men who had carried it, though, the legacy was more personal. Many returned home with the sound still ringing in their ears. The deep, measured thud of each burst. The smell of burnt powder mixed with snow. Some could never forget it. To them, the BR was not just a weapon, but a symbol of everything they had endured. It represented the narrow line between order and chaos, between holding and breaking. One veteran, interviewed years later, summed it up simply. When the bar fired, you knew you still had a chance. In Germany, the aftermath took a different shape. Civilians, once certain of victory, now watched their cities burn. Soldiers returning from the front brought stories of American firepower that no propaganda could deny. The myth of invincibility had died in the forests of Belgium. Even officers who survived admitted privately that the Ardennes marked the moment they knew the war was lost. The industrial might of the Allies was crushing, but it was the determination of the infantry and the precision of their weapons that made defeat undeniable. By the spring of 1945, the Rhine was crossed, the German heartland lay open, and the road to Berlin began. The men who had fought through the Bulge carried their BARs with them until the very end. Some were replaced by newer weapons, but most stayed in service until the final surrender. They were worn smooth, their stocks scarred, their bluing faded, but they still fired. They had done their job too well to be retired early. And as Europe burned toward its final silence, one truth remained clear. The weapon that had begun as an afterthought in World War I had, in the final months of World War II, become the symbol of endurance and victory. It was the gun that never gave up, because the men who carried it never did. The end of the Ardennes was not just the end of a battle, it was the end of German hope, the beginning of Allied inevitability, and the proof that in war, the smallest rhythm, the pulse of a single rifle, can decide the fate of nations. When the last shells fell silent over Europe, and the soldiers finally laid down their weapons, the war left behind more than ruins. It left lessons, carved in the mud, frozen in the forests, and etched into the hearts of those who survived. Among all the symbols of that struggle, the tanks, the planes, the grand strategies, it was the simple, relentless rhythm of the Browning automatic rifle that carried a quieter truth about modern war. The BAR was never the most advanced weapon on the battlefield. It lacked the blinding rate of the MG-42 or the precision of the sniper's scope, but it had something else, a perfect balance of power and control, of human strength and mechanical reliability. It was a weapon made for endurance, not spectacle. In the hands of an American infantryman, it turned defense into defiance, fear into momentum, and ordinary soldiers into the anchors of their armies. Its story, especially in the Ardennes, was not one of technology, but of will. In the frozen forests, when radios failed, when commanders were cut off, and when hope seemed to slip away, the BR kept firing. Its sound was a heartbeat that reminded men they were not alone. It did not change history through innovation, but through constancy. That constancy, the quiet refusal to yield, became the essence of victory itself. For the German soldiers who faced it, the BAR became the embodiment of an enemy that refused to break. It was the weapon that shattered assaults, that turned ambition into despair. For those who carried it, it was a lifeline, heavy, brutal, and utterly dependable. It taught them that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to keep firing when fear was all that remained. Today, the BAR rests in museums and collections, its steel dulled by time. Yet its legacy endures in every modern automatic rifle, in every soldier who trusts the rhythm of their weapon to hold the line. The war moved on, technology evolved, but the lesson never changed. Battles are not won by machines alone, but by the human hands that refuse to let them fall silent. That was the real power of the BAR. Not the rounds it fired, but the resolve it carried.